So let it be written, so let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors. This is a deep dive on problem players. Have you ever had a problem player that you had to actually sit down, deal with, and talk to? Or is this something that you've just seen happen peripherally, guys?
I've been pretty lucky for the most part. Across at least for my long running games, I've been pretty lucky, but I've also been pretty careful. I'm very choosy with who I like. Because I play mostly online, most of the games that I play in or run are like players that are handpicked from the community. So I kind of know what I'm getting for the most part. My very couple small instances of problem players are all either like way back when I very first started playing, or to be honest, were people who were one-off, games where I kind of picked them, not knowing them at all, and then they ended up being pretty bad. And to be honest, my solution for that was just to not invite them to more games. So I haven't necessarily had to have a lot of sit-down conversations of this person's really messing up this game. The only times I should have had those conversations with people way back, but we didn't have the table sort of knowledge and know-how of the hobby yet to sort of go into those things.
Yeah, and I'm very much the same way as Jeff in the sense that I've had some one-off players that I had issues with, whether I was GM or just another player, where it just kind of wasn't meshing. And it was very much the same thing where rather than trying to fix them, you know what I mean? It was easier just to go, okay, well, I'm going to play with the people I'm more familiar with and keep trying. It has definitely happened to me more with board games, and I'm actually feel the very same as Jeff there, where I wish I had known or at least been comfortable enough to have some of those conversations with some players, because I've definitely dealt with a few different issues with a few different people in board games, mostly I think because I've played those a lot more. But I think a lot of the same stuff applies for sure, where talking to them is kind of the solution, but what you say and how you approach it is very nuanced, I think.
Yeah, and we talked about this before the show, but it's one of those things where it's tempting to try to deal with it in game. Don't do that, no matter what happens. It's a stunted, patronizing sort of thing in every case. There's no reason to take a real problem of someone who's either being disruptive or who's constantly late or constantly on their phone and trying to preach at them with an NPC who's like, look, I walked off the cliff because I'm on my mobile rock. So that's number one. As much as you hear people say, well, I'm going to punish them in game and this is what I'm going to do. It's kind of, I don't want to be pejorative about it, but it's
childish. I mean, really,
childish. It's impetuous.
It's kind of textbook childish.
It is.
It's low-minded. It's not going to solve a real problem.
And it ends up it can make the problem worse, because it can kind of end up stoking the sort of antagonistic competition, I think, between people.
Good
where
call.
it becomes almost a sort of underhanded game at that point. So yeah, I think it's very important that in the topic of problem players, no matter what type of problem, whatever variety of issue that you're having, that fighting fire with fire is just not the way to do it in RPGs.
Right.
And yeah, I've seen people do exactly the sort of thing where you're talking about, where it's the person who has too much out of character conversations, the GM will be like, okay, well, I'm just going to take everything they say as in character, no matter how stupid it is. And it's just that doesn't make the game better for anybody. Nobody's having more fun because the thing that you said about how oh, we should totally kill this guy. And the guy's like, what? You're going to kill me? Because you said that in real life and not as a human. And it's just that's, if everybody at the table is yeah, we like those gotcha moments. We're here for it. Let's, really make this game a minefield. Fair enough. If that's the goal, then that's the goal. But I think far and away across the board, those types of solutions end up just making everybody at the table more frustrated and increases problems, because then it starts arguments. It starts, people, it never makes things better. It's just at best it masks the issue so that everybody just has a worse time, but in secret, or it outrightly makes things worse.
Right.
So yeah, it's ways that kind of go into the game itself of like, someone's not paying attention, so I'm just going to skip their turn, or they talk too much, so their words are in character, and I'm just going to treat everything and it's just like, yeah, that's not, in my experience, that'll never make the table feel better. It'll just, yeah, it never helps.
Yeah, following that to sort of its natural logical conclusion, I thought of an example where it kind of works, where I've seen some people being upset that people are playing their music loud, so their solution is to play their own music loud. Like, okay, well, if the problem is the sound, you've not made it any better. If there are other people, or you know what I mean? Like, and I mentioned this phrase before, but I'm like, it's a race to the bottom. Where if you just follow that to the end, I'm like, okay, well, now more people are upset. You've let yourself get upset. Like you said, it's just, there's no real worth in it. And I think it's just very important to get that out of the way first, that can tend not to be a very good solution for the problem.
Sure. And so I think it's also important to talk about, like, well, you have to decide what a problem is also. We're using some pretty specific examples, but if you guys and girls have decided what is allowed at your table in your session 0, which we highly recommend, then there should be a baseline, and that's easier to reference. Jeff, you've worded it very well, and I won't right now, but basically you have to tell people what you're expecting, or you have no business expecting it. So I think it's important to manage this stuff up front, but most disruptive players, well, I'll say this. There's a mix of disruptive players. There are players who, if you just talk to them and then you sort of put a light on it, it's like, oh gosh, I had no idea. You're right, and I hadn't considered it that way. I can be really oblivious like that sometimes. But then there are other problem players who'll be like, so? That's a different kind of problem player. Like, the problem player who, yeah, so big deal, like whatever. So I think it's important to, at least to start with, make sure you have set what you expect, and then when you bring it up, and we're gonna use like certain examples of like what to do and how to say it, but the kind of problem player I think that we're all like is the one that's like, yeah, whatever. And we'll try, but there's little in terms of like, short of getting rid of them in many cases. Like, in the same way that I'm not gonna let someone take my happiness in my day-to-day life by dealing with them over and over if they focus on negativity, I usually won't spend as much of my time around them. I will do the same thing in gaming, because I don't want to spend 4 hours devoted with you pretending to be sad, like feeling real feelings of negativity. So, yeah. What do you guys, you got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be very much along those same lines, where it's like, RPGs as a hobby is a very time and energy intensive hobby, minimum 2 to 3 hours. Some people will play at a time for 5 to 8 to 12 hours, in a day. And it's like, that's a lot of time and energy to devote. And that's just in the game. If you're running the game, you also have to prep the game and think about the game and, and all these different things. I don't have the time or the energy to deal with people who are going to be indifferent to the sort of way that the game is going. So if someone's like, hey, this part of the game is really upsetting to me, the way that you did this, it really made me uncomfortable. If their response is, who cares? Then honestly, like, maybe this is cold of me. They're gone. Like, they're out of the game. Like, I just don't have it. If I'm going to spend all this time and all this energy on this, it needs to be fun and it needs to be a good time. And there are so many people who will make it good and make it fun that there's no reason to devote time or space or energy to someone who's going to be outright hostile. If they're willing to talk, if they're willing to work, I'll gladly have a conversation with them, and I'll gladly try to find compromises and like, oh, well, I totally understand that, maybe this behavior is disruptive, but it really makes it fun for me to be able to use my character to do these things. Can we find a way to work it out? That I'll gladly hear out. But if their answer is like, so I can do what I want, then it's like, okay, well, I can do what I want to. And, dismiss you.
Yeah, I think that's just like very clearly somebody not buying into the game at all. You know what I mean? Like, this is not a person that's playing the same game as you. And I've had that with board games, especially, like I said, where there's this weird thing that happens sometimes where whether somebody expected something different or just thought it was something else, or I have had more situations than seems reasonable that people sat down to play a game and then had no interest in playing the game. And so that's kind of the way I describe that, where I'm like, no, those people are gone because it seems like they would like nothing more than to go do something else, because there's no respect for the game. You know what I mean? Like, there's no amount of, oh, I'm going to let you do this because this is your time too. So it's like, yes, I don't think that opinion toward people like that is cold, because it's like, no, I mean, it sounds like they just don't want to play games, which is okay. So what are we doing here?
Yeah, that's a good point. And so actually made a list of things I want to cover on this boogie rag with this lip moisturizer. Let me see here. No, but so I think exactly what you're saying, James. So there are a few things that I want to cover. And so the first thing is there are a lot of different settings that we're talking about. And I think that the degree with which you deal with someone disruptive and spend your time with it is directly correlated to the kind of setting. And here's what I mean. If you're playing at a convention, there's really little you can do. For me, it's just grit your teeth. Sorry, this is going to probably be a bad experience. Mitigate where you can and try to just do damage control. You probably won't ever see this person again if you're lucky. If you're at a gaming store and you have a regular that's coming back in, that's also a little different because that's someone else's customer. So you might have to involve the people at the gaming store a little bit, and if it's an open table and you have to, So what we're specifically talking about, those are kind of different. We're talking about your game that you are in a home group or an online group that you're going to play in regularly, not Adventure League play and in other arenas. These tips can be applied to those things, but I wanted to say that outright because those are like special ops. Those are different kinds of things that take a different skill set. But you also have to know what you're in for. If you play and run a convention game and don't know the people, if you play and run at a game shop and you don't know the people, et cetera, the wild cards are aplenty. That aside, let's talk about some specific things that can come up and then some specific ways to handle that. This is going to be a blend of actual situations and also sort of like kind of problem player types, but the first thing I'm going to say is people who are late. And I'm going to throw it to you guys in a second. I'm going to give you an unpopular opinion. People who are late tend to be late in every aspect of their life. You're not special. And the way that they show up to your game 30 minutes, 40 minutes late, it's never worked for me to try to change this person as a human being. They're late to work every day. They're late to whatever. So you're no different. You're just lumped in. They're late. What I've done that works really well is, well, first of all, here's what don't do. Don't say that it's at 4 if it's at 5 and like trick them and do any of that stuff. That's weird. And the one time they show up early and find out you did that, it causes a problem. And so what I have learned to do is create a soft arrival time for anyone who is going to show up and say, hey, if it's an in-person game, all right, hey, from 4 to 5, we're going to be eating dinner and hanging out. I highly just come on over at 4 or whenever you can. We're going to start at 5. This tends to work because then that person shows up at 4:20, 4:30, and it doesn't matter because there was a soft sort of like eat, chill time, whenever. If they're late to the game, the rule is kind of just I start and then we'll fill them in as they get there, even if they're an hour late, whatever. So for me, I just kind of pretend like they're not late. I go on as though they're not late. That's it. That's worked the best for me. Everything else has caused fights. What about you guys? You have anything to say about late players?
So yeah, I do think that it can be different in online games compared to home games because you tend to not have as much time, especially for like arrival windows of like most of the online games that I play in is literally like I get in my car after work, I drive home, I walk into my house, I sit down at my desk, and the game is starting. Like, so there's not really room to like I'm just going to be, at my computer for 30 minutes. But I think for the most part, like in one-off situations, especially, I'm almost always just like, yeah, whatever. Like, it's just not worth making a big deal about. Now, if it's like causing problems regularly, where it's like every single time they're like an hour late, then it's like, okay, you kind of have to then ask, like, what's going on? Is what's happening here that's causing this problem regularly? Is it like that this time doesn't actually, like, you thought the time was going to work for you, but it takes you longer to get home from work than you thought, and now suddenly it's not quite working, and they're just too hesitant to ask to change the game time or whatever, to like make it half an hour later or whatever. Or is it that they just don't care about the game that much and they'll just show when they show up? So kind of figuring out why, is a big thing, because there's a very big difference to me between like, man, I thought I could make 6. I thought I could do it, and it's just every time I'm just a little bit late, and it's just like, I'm totally willing to work with that person or just say, oh yeah, just show up at 6:15. We'll kind of get things going, but you can just hop right in. And it's just like, I don't really care that much. But if it's just like, yeah, they're an hour late, they're an hour and a half late, and it's just like, oh, what was going on? It's like, oh, I was out with my friends and I just didn't feel like, it's just like that to me is a very different conversation than, I was trying to get home from work and there was traffic today and I'm super sorry. So it kind of depends more case by case on like the person and how, apologetic they are and the sorts of reasonings that they might have. Like, I'm totally happy to work with those people. And there are people who are like late to almost every game that I'm just totally willing to be okay with, because I know that that's like the best that they can do and that they are genuinely trying. They're always excited. Once they show up, they're like, yes, I'm so happy to be here. I'm so sorry I'm late. I'll just let that happen, basically, as long as it's not causing a huge problem. But if the person just can't be bothered, to show up, that to me, again, starts to fall into, especially online, where I have 15 people I could message, to play in this game right now.
Yeah.
Do I need the person who's not going to care?
Right.
I probably don't need them or want them.
Yeah, and I think that it's sort of coming back to a few of the same things, but especially if that, like you said, you're willing to give somebody a lot more leeway if they're into it, if they're really going for it. And as you said, if it's the best they can do. That's an important thing, because I sometimes feel like I am very difficult to schedule with, but it's because I'm extremely over communicative in a sense that I will say, hey guys, if I'm going to get home and I might be late, I'll say, let's push the game 10 minutes. You know what I mean? I'm the guy that's like, no, I can't do it that night because something might come up and I'd hate to cancel, and I realize that I'm like, I just get that stuff out in front. So for those people where it's like the best they can do or something, I've realized that sometimes I'm that person, but instead of being late, I just am. I used to think I was just very picky about which nights I like to play, but now I realize I'm like, no, I want to make sure that there's never a time that I'm canceling or late. And I can't expect that from everyone, So again, I do think that their attitude toward the game makes a big difference, because again, I'm just not going to play with the guy that was just hanging out with his friends, or, you know what I mean? I'm like, I'm surprised that guy even shows up, basically.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And so, I think, as we're talking about, it's less about RPGs and more about just dealing with people and like your friends and like understanding. It's about being reasonable and expecting them to be reasonable back. So that's the late player. So let's talk about that now. Let's move into the disruptive player, which I think is kind of, when we say problem player, if someone wants to optimize their character, min-max, whatever, that's not a problem to me. That's just the way the game is. And so we're not talking about that, but it's people who, and I'll, there are a lot of different kinds, but let's define it as someone who either is kind of going off on their own all the time, where they're trying to play a single player mission, or everything is a fight, a skirmish, a kill. Let's rob the thing. Let's destroy. The colloquial term for this is like a murder hobo, where they're interested in disrupting the peace of the world with their chaos as a player, and that's how that they have fun. As I mentioned, I personally don't think you should say anything in the moment like, no, Todd, you can't kill the guard. So let's talk about some real dialogue, and I'm putting you guys on the spot here. it's a player who's relatively new and the guard tells them no or challenges them in a way. You know, this is something that you did as a game master to sort of block the door, you know, but they're like, okay, fine. So he won't let me through. All right, so I stab him. What do you do?
Oh, so I think part of it too, it depends on sort of like experience and understanding of like different people's tables operate differently for these sorts of things. And also some people just don't necessarily understand that like when you have RPGs as compared to other, you know, gaming mediums like video games or something where you might not even be physically able to stab the guard, like the game doesn't let you do that. When suddenly like the opportunity opens up, there's I think a temptation for a lot of people to then take advantage of the fact that they can do anything and everything, and they want to do that. So sometimes this is like the one exception that I will make to like saying something in the moment of just like making sure they understand that what they do, while they can do anything, especially if they're a new player, that you can do anything, but that those things will have consequences. So it's like, okay, I just want to make sure that like, you know, technically within the rules you can stab the guard, but I just want to make sure that you understand that, you know, if another guard sees this or if this gets noticed, that, you know, they'll probably be, you know, imprisoned or exiled or punished or, you know, that, and it might derail the game. Like, are we sure that we're okay with this happening? And if the guy's like, yes, I understand, then it's like, okay, like it's either you start a fight out of character now and try to work through it, or you just let it happen and deal with it later. But that is sort of the one thing that I'll double check with in the game is like, all right, you can do that, but there might be severe drawbacks for doing so, you know? But then outside of that, I think that just, again, having a conversation with them just extremely openly. And again, I agree with Tim that, you know, step one, that this should always be private, that you should, you know, find a way that you can talk to them one-on-one as a person. The second you call them out in front of everybody, it's immediately like, it's just human nature to dig your heels in and to get defensive. And that's not what you want. That doesn't help solve the problem. And just to say like, hey, I just, you know, I wanted to check in about the game. You know, it's totally okay that you know, that you like the freedom of being able to do whatever you want to. And it's really cool that you're taking advantage of that. But, you know, when you killed the guard and, you know, got the whole party kicked out of the town, you know, that really, you know, made Tim didn't have a fun time. You know, he was really excited to talk with the king, and you disrupted the meeting by killing the guard. He was looking forward to that. And, you know, is there a way that we can find a way to like maneuver some of this chaos? Because you like the chaos, and that's okay. We can find a way to make that work. You know, let's see if we can find a way to direct it somewhere that's not going to make everybody else's game worse, you know, basically. You know, is that something that you're open to? Is that okay? And just basically trying to talk as openly and straightforwardly as you can, I think, is always my go-to solution with these sorts of things. And it's very likely that they'll say like, oh, I didn't know that, you know, I thought everyone else was like, yeah, this will be fun. And then, but I didn't know that they were actually, you know, super put off by it. You know, yeah, I'll be happy to find a way to do that in another way. You know, that sort of conversation is usually how that goes down. But yeah, just letting them know and then asking if they're willing to find a way to compromise, you know, I think is always the easiest way.
Yeah. Overall, I very much take the same route that Jeff does, in the sense that when a player says, you know, in that case, oh, I'll stab them, I just remind them of some of the things. Like that example, you're going to see the king, you're outside. Maybe this guy's stopping you. He doesn't know you've got an invitation from the king. So, you know, there's a few steps to that where one, they're like, oh, I stab him. And I go, okay, well, so you can try and stab him. You start to reach for your weapon. But remember, there's a couple more guards around. And that, yes, you need to speak to the king, but killing the guard is probably not going to be a good look. Do you still want to do it? Yeah, you know, I think I want to get this guy. I go, okay, so the battle's going to be kind of loud. You know, probably it's unlikely he'll get away with it. What are the rest of you doing while he tries to do this? Usually one of the other players goes, oh, well, I try to stop him. You know, basically like some GMs, and I've done the same thing before, they forget that because a player says something, it doesn't mean it happens. It means it begins to happen or starts to happen. And it almost gives in the game, it's almost like sometimes you can deal with that in the game because you can still have that player going, oh, that's what my guy would do. He would try to stab this guard because he said a specific insult about my mother. He gets to have that character moment while the rest of the players go, but we stop him. And even though the guard is, offended, we pay him off and we get through or something. It's like you can play around in that area, but really failing that, yes. I mean, I guess we can't restate this enough. Talk to the player outside the game and see if they're willing to even consider having a little empathy for, the fun and enjoyment of everyone else at the table.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I kind of want to mention that it dawned on me, Jeff, when you mentioned what you mentioned, which is I feel like there's this middle ground. So I'm going to call it the D&D, or no, we'll call it like the Game Master Referee uniform, where we call ourselves the referee, but a lot of times we're just the storyteller and we're another player. So there's normal storyteller mode, and then that's one end of the spectrum. The opposite end of the spectrum is talking to that person outside of the game. The middle ground is what you guys are both describing, and we're going to call it, like I said, like the referee uniform, which is you sort of stand in the middle of the field and you don't throw a flag, but you're like, hey, just a reminder. And one of the things that I'll try to use is real world examples, because then it's like, oh, well, if you say, so you could do that, but I just want to kind of give you a reminder of what this world is like. That would be the equivalent of killing a police officer. And then it's like, oh, it's like, so in this world, do you want to do the equivalent of killing a police officer and the ramifications that would come with it? Because when you sort of make it real and pin it to something that sounds like that, it's like, wow, that sounds really scummy. And then, as you say, you can say, now you can choose to do that, but and again, we talked about over communicating, which is like, listen, that would probably derail the whole quest, and the king would not be happy. So I would just ask that you consider this heavily, before you do it. And if they still do it, there are still ways. I wouldn't railroad anybody, but you can have the guards use non-lethal force and bring them before the king anyway, and then just punish that player, but not, say, well, now you have to serve in this way. And now there's actually a story element that, does things. So referee hat is that just like, okay, hey, I just want to remind you before you guys do steal that person's, that treasure right there is free. It is open, but that would be the equivalent of kicking in a window and taking things out of a window in the real world. Like, you kind of just go, oh. So it's like, are you sure you want to cross that line into doing that? And if you do, okay. So that's the first thing. Like, the referee is the middle ground, and it's okay to address it. Where the line comes is when you address someone's personal behavior in an out-of-game way, when it's no longer reliant to the rules. So here's the tips. We talked about tips and how to talk and exactly what to say. Let me give you the thing that's helped me the most, maybe in my life, in terms of dealing with these kind of conflicts. It's human nature that we want to solve the problem immediately in many cases. My thought is, as long as you talk about it before the next game, there's no problem letting some time pass. How much time passes is up to you, but there's no problem letting 3-4 days pass. If you play on a Friday night, there's nothing wrong with, talking to them on a Tuesday, talking to that person. And the other thing I would highly recommend is, if you can wait until you see them again in person, it almost always goes way better face to face if you can do it before the game. If not, I would also recommend a phone call. Now, for the people that play online, an online message could work. I would even recommend recording like a voice message into Facebook or some of those things. The reason why I say that is because through text, people get upset, they skip words, they read it once, it solidifies in their brain what you mean, and it causes these problems. So the two things, number one thing and number one thing number two, are wait a little bit of time. Let some things fade. Not enough time to where they'll be like, I don't remember that. A day at least, but usually 2-3 days. Talk to them in person And then the third thing, and this is super, super helpful, is ask questions that are meaningful. So I'm going to give you one specifically that you can use. Hey, let me ask you, what was fun for you the other night when you stabbed the guard? That way, so you can ask, what was fun for you about X? And that can help you get to the bottom of it. So that's a specific question. So how do you start the conversation? Hey, we've been having a lot of fun playing in this game. There were some things that I wanted to kind of talk through with you just to make sure that we're all having the same kind of fun. And say it that way, just to make sure we're all having the same kind of fun. Hey, what was fun for you the other night when you robbed that farmer? Like, what part of that kind of... Those two questions, or that phrasing and then that question, can, I think, start off a conversation rather than coming... And what you don't want to do, and I'll end it with this and throw it to these guys, you don't want to come at them with an accusation. It's important to ask questions first because their perception of things might be very different than yours. You have to align your perceptions and see it from their perspective in order to get a real result. And I think where most of these things go 100% sour is you ask your buddy, hey, I'm going to talk to Mike. Don't you think that? Yeah, and he did this. Yeah. Okay. So you already judge, jury, and executioner. Mike's been hanged at dawn. And then you come to Mike and you go, hey, Mike, here's what you did, and here's what we're doing about it, and here's why, and here's that. And he's like, what the? Don't do that. Go to the person and ask them, hey, what was fun for you about that? Let's talk through this. And that is how that's some practical, really good advice, I think, that's helped me.
Yeah, and I think one of the really helpful things about that question specifically is what kind of what did that add to the game for you to be able to do that? Is then some of these behaviors, now some behaviors that you might need to put a hard stop on, like if you're pickpocketing the other party members and they're getting mad, because they're losing their stuff and because they didn't roll the perception check in game, their character doesn't know it was you, but they as the player know it, and it's just if it's like that and people are getting mad, then it's you might just need to say hey, we need that to stop. I'm sorry. But for some behaviors, there's ways that you can, instead of having to say hey, you need to stop stabbing guards or stop stealing treasure, to say hey, sometimes, it's disrupting things, but how do you feel about finding ways for you to do those sorts of things, in the context of helping the party out? So rather than stabbing the guard at the meeting, let's see if we can put you in a situation where being disruptive is helpful to the party. You're in a situation and there's one guard who hates everybody else and he's causing a problem and he's going off on his own, and you can steal something from him because that would help the other guards who hate him, and because that, just we'll give you ways to steal to steal treasure, we'll give you ways to sneak up and assassinate, and have that kind of fun. But if we can rein it in a little bit so that we can direct it towards ways that'll help and not hurt other people's fun, then kind of everybody gets to have their cake and eat it too. And that can be very, that can be just as much a solution as hey, please stop stealing people, please stop pickpocketing people, to okay, but what if we can get you to pickpocket the orc chieftain who has the keys to the prison cell, rather than pickpocketing the guard who has his money that he needs to feed his family? You still get to steal, you still get to cause carnage and cause chaos, but against the people who we want that to happen against, not against the people at the table who are trying to have fun too. And that sort of framing can help, I think, a lot to alleviate that of we're not saying what you're doing is bad, we just need to structure it a little bit differently so that it doesn't cause as much harm, and that can be a lot easier to swallow than you need to stop, like what Tim was saying.
Yeah, and sort of touching on what the two of you guys have said, because you touched on some very important things. So Tim, letting some time pass, especially, I think, because another thing that we tend not to realize is if the person did act poorly, say we have this problem player, they likely know it and they are potentially embarrassed by it. Obviously, you have that style of player that we talked about where they just don't care and they're simply not going to engage on it, and that's sort of a different story. But Tim, you gave the example where if somebody was drinking and swearing, where if you were to say something to them then, obviously, especially in the case of actual chemical, drunkenness, But then specifically, as the time goes by, their perception of the night shifts in a way that's good, where they are far enough away from it, and then you are as well. So I think that's one of the big things about letting time pass, is that idea that they will remember it more like, oh yeah, I had some stuff going on. Like, it just becomes this sort of blob of, they don't remember that they were mean to so-and-so. They remember that they just didn't have a good time and it was kind of their fault. The other important thing is that idea that both with the asking questions like that, Tim, and avoiding accusations, the other thing is to tell them what you felt, because that's not something they have control over, nor something that really changes. It doesn't matter if they did something they feel wasn't that bad, but if you go, hey, I know that, you kind of can be that way sometimes, but really in this case, it really hurt my feelings because of this. I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong. I'm saying if you want us to hang out, you can't do that because I don't like it. You can do that with other people that are fine with it. This is not an indictment on you, and that separation is very important, because then Jeff, obviously that goes into what you said, where, yeah, find other ways for them to pickpocket, find other ways to sort of funnel that creativity. To some degree, you're very likely friends or know these people. So just kind of remember that, and remember that there's nothing wrong with that communication and that giving some time, and really just like, no, we have sort of a shared context where, like, I know Tim. So if we have a fight in a game, it's like, well, there's a lot more to it. We have 90%, 99% of the rest of our time together has been fine. So one fight doesn't define our relationship. It's easy to get sort of lofty with this style of thing, but overall, just remember that it is friends and you're trying to have fun playing a game. And if everybody treats it that way, you can solve some of these problems without it really being a big issue.
Yeah, and I do think you make a really important point too about, it's such a huge difference in perception. Like, if you can kind of shoulder some of the responsibility of the problem of, like, it's not necessarily that what you did is wrong or that you're bad for doing it, but it just, I felt bad because this happened, and it's not necessarily that you're bad because of that. It's just like, this is just the way that I'm feeling. So it would help me if you could do this for me, rather than like, you need to fix what you're doing because we're telling you that it's wrong. Like that, even though the end result, changing the behavior, is the same, it's a very big difference in like how it feels, I think. And it feels much less targeted. Like, here's what you did wrong and you need to change. It's like, hey, if you could help me out by changing this because I'm having a difficulty, managing it, I think that's a lot easier for people to deal with and to understand than like, you have done something bad that you need to change because I've decreed it so.
Yeah. And, those are actually two really good distinctions, which is make it about you a little bit. It's like, hey, listen, this is something that it's probably, and don't use like false humility. Like, hey, it's probably just me, but that's not, I think, what either of these guys are saying.
It should be sincere. Yeah.
It's sincerely of like, hey,
definitely.
listen, that's just kind of, it's not fun for me. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry that that's not fun for me. Like, but I can't make it fun for me. The thing I'll close with is, and it might sound counterintuitive to everything else that we've said, but it has its place in good measure, and it's choose your battles. As game masters, we want games to be what we consider perfect. And it's an ideal that you can chase forever and never reach, and that's cool. But don't nitpick. Don't hand out speeding tickets in terms of like, well, no, you're doing this again, you're doing this. It's okay to let some things ride and let it be a blip and let Mike pull a knife on the guard and maybe even stab the guard, but maybe it just doesn't matter in that case. You know what I mean? Like, it's okay to hand wave some stuff and not make everything specifically that could potentially be a problem be a problem. My advice to you would be to identify patterns. Someone makes a mistake, they make a mistake. Or if someone makes a bad choice, they make a bad choice. If it's a consistent string of things. And so I guess it's important to equip you also with, it's probably not worth saying something the first time something happens. Or it's not worth saying something to someone in private of like, hey man, it was really weird that you pulled the knife on that guard. Now, if you want to make a joke about it at the table, like, hey guys, what kind of game are we playing here? Am I right, everybody? Like addressing the group. what kind of game are we playing here? We're stabbing the guards? You guys are nuts. Kind of make a little bit of a light comment about it. Be like, yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. But that's probably a cooler way to handle it the first time. Now, second time, it's like, I think Mike is a serial killer. No. But anyway, anything else you guys want to say before we wrap things up?
Yeah, I'll just second that what you say there, which is that I think it's important that, like, if it starts to be, if the table starts to become this environment where it feels like everyone has to be a watchdog about other people's behavior, like that really can start to hurt the table in its own way. And I think I just wanted to basically second what you just said, Tim, of like, it can, sometimes the best thing is just to not make a big deal out of it. If it is a big deal, then deal with it. But if it's not a big deal, then it's just like, yeah, sometimes this one player might do that thing where you kind of wish he didn't do the thing. And it's just like, but you probably have those things for other people at the table too. And if everyone has to start, policing every bit of behavior that they don't personally like, it can start to feel very restrictive and stifling of just like, I can't do anything without somebody saying that they didn't like, if I have a conversation with the guard, then he complains that there's not enough action. If I stab the guard, then he complains that I'm messing up the story. And it's just like, there's a certain part of just like, okay, he might talk a little bit too much sometimes, but that's okay. I'll just let him talk. Maybe he'll talk for 5 minutes instead of 3. That's okay. The game will continue on. I don't need to like call him out on that, that there's some things that it's just okay to just let be, as long as it's not like Tim said. If it's causing a problem all the time and it's causing big problems all the time, then yes, definitely deal with it and use all the tips that we've given. But small problems don't, if you have a spider in your house, a nuclear bomb is not the way to deal with it. And that solution that applies across a lot of the board too, where it's like, if you have this crazy, response of like, hey, I really need to talk to you. We need to talk about your behavior at the table. It's just like, and then you go on to say like, yeah, it's just sometimes you talk for a little bit, more. And it's just like, I feel like I'm waiting for you to be done. It's just like, you felt like you needed to like have this huge conversation about that because I talked for 30 seconds. It's just like that.
We'd all be having so many conversations with each other on this channel.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's just be measured, in how you proportion your response to the situation. And if it is causing huge problems, then, deal with it. But yeah, if it starts to become too much of like everybody's being watched by everybody else to like get the thing that's not perfect to them, then the game ends up being just bad for everybody.
Yeah, and I'll end it with a sort of a phrase that I've come up with that has evolved over the years to kind of use this, which is, don't use a cannon when a pistol will do, and sometimes a handshake will avoid pistols altogether. So we're Tabletop Terrors. We're all about fun, creativity, and tabletop RPGs, tabletop games in general. If you like that sort of thing, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have new videos every Sunday and every Thursday. As you noticed, we do a quick tips video followed by a deep dive. This has been our deep dive on problem players. What about you? This is a topic that is going to span the gamut. There are going to be people who have horror stories and people who tell us that I've never had a problem player. I don't know what you guys are talking about. But in the comments, what I was really looking for was there anything that needed more clarity or that you feel like you can bring to the conversation that we might have missed or ill-equipped people with? I don't want to give people exact words to put in their mouths and then have it explode. So help us. What can we do to make sure that these conversations are productive and they're positive? That's what we really want. I guess let's end it with a Tabtarian toast.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first problem player.
and may you conquer everything you undertake.
Just kidding. I'm like the Dexter of problem players. I'm a problem player that kills other problem players. Jeff, tell me a story. Tell me a story about a problem player.
All right, so this was back when my very first group that I played with, which was just friends that we knew each other, like in school and stuff like that, and we were all very brand new, so we didn't have the knowledge and experience to like deal with things like people, and we were also a lot younger and stupider at the time. So we start a home game. We're running through like a loose module, like it's not exactly the module, but it's kind of based around it, and one of the players, was really into this whole like snowflakey character thing. He wants to be weird races and weird classes. So we asked the GM of like, hey, I found this homebrew race. I'd like to play it. Is that okay? And the GM, we didn't really know game rules and balance very well then. So the GM was just like, yeah, sure, whatever. And it turned out like the player didn't know this. It wasn't their fault, but it was one of those things where like some random person just made it and uploaded it. And it was like way overpowered and broken and stupid. To the point where it was like they were so much better than all of us because they had this. And it was just like, okay, well, what do we do about this? Because, it's so imbalanced that it's messing up the game. And that's not fun. So the GM was like, okay, I have an idea. I was like, okay, that's fine. Whatever your idea is, you can just do that. Not knowing that, this is going to go horribly wrong and be really bad. So the GM, without telling the player, without having any conversation of like, hey, this is really imbalanced. Can we find a way to, tone it down? Can we have you switch to a different race? Like, you can even stay the same. Like, none of that sort of thing. It was just like, all right, you guys are going through this tunnel. We were doing like a dungeon crawl thing. And specifically and arbitrarily, a trap is triggered by that guy's character, specifically targeted by the GM, where he's hit by a magic arrow that shape changes his character into a different race mechanically and aesthetically. And it wasn't even that the player didn't even get to pick what he got turned into. The GM rolled for it on like a reincarnation table and said like, okay, instead of being that race, you're an elf now. So change all your stats to the normal elf. It's just like, in retrospect, it was just like, it's such like, if you want exactly an example of how not to solve problems at a table, like shining example right there of just like, none of us knew any better at the time. And it was just so stupid.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next video will be problem GMs. Hey.